Last Comanche Chief, Chapter 3.
The capture of Naudah, the raid leader, always travels first. He goes to the first camp first, and when he camps, he looks back at the others, one after the other. When they have all arrived, he holds a council and says, "Back in the village, I decided to go to war. Everybody knows it, women and children. Now I see you here, I feel glad, a big party. We are going to war." Quanah Parker, 18,971. When Quanah was born, Cynthia Ann Parker was the wife of Peta Nocona, whose name in English means he who travels alone and returns. Since the Comanches practiced polygamy, she was one of several wives, one of whom was reported to be Spanish. Late in his life, Quanah wrote, "From the best information I have, I was born about 1850 on Elk Creek, just below the Wichita Mountains." This estimate is supported by the account hunters gave of their encounter with Cynthia Ann when she was caring for Quanah and his brother Pina, sometimes referred to as Pecoses, at Nocona's camp along the Canadian River in 1851. When asked if she would like to return to her people, she shook her head and pointed to her little naked barbarians sporting at her feet. 3. It is evident that Cynthia Ann had adopted all the habits and peculiarities of the Comanches. She had an Indian husband and children and could not be persuaded to leave them. Her brother, who had been ransomed by a trader and brought home to his relatives, was sent back by his mother for the purpose of endeavoring to prevail upon his sister to leave the Indians and return to her family. But he stated that on his arrival she refused to listen to the proposition, saying that her husband, children, and all that she held most dear were with the Indians, and there she should remain. At the time of Cynthia Ann's capture at Parker's Fort in 1836, the Comanches were near the peak of their power. George Catlin estimates their number then at between 30 and 40,000, with some 6,000 to 7,000 well-armed, well-mounted warriors. With buffalo in the millions and antelope and wild horses in the tens of thousands, the people had ready access to their favorite foods. Their enemies, particularly the Utes and Apaches, continued to extract a toll of Comanche warriors killed in battle. But their main enemy was the white man's diseases. Frequent raids to Mexico exposed warriors to venereal diseases, smallpox, and cholera. To the north, peaceful contact with traders, as well as hostile action against travelers on the Santa Fe Trail, enabled disease to spread through the Comanche bands. With no natural resistance to alien diseases, the Comanches suffered heavy losses in the smallpox epidemics of 1818 and 1839 to 1840, and the cholera outbreak of 1849, brought on by travelers crossing from the east on their way to California. Colonel W.S. Nye, in his Carbine and Lance, states that a tragic byproduct of the gold rush was the introduction of Asiatic cholera into the plains. The disease spread to the Kiowas and Comanches. They say that 1849 was the most terrible period which they can remember. More than half of them perished, and survivors were utterly terrified. 5. The principal human enemy of the Comanches after 1840 was still the Texas Ranger. Nevertheless, the northern bands continued to raid into Mexico and along the western fringes of the expanding white settlements. The elusive Quahadas and other Comanche bands made many such raids, but could always return to the safety of their wilderness home along the thinly timbered valleys of the Canadian Red, Pease, Washita, Pecos, and Arkansas rivers. A significant change in white Indian relations took place in 1845. Texas became a state and the U.S. Army assumed primary responsibility for the protection of the frontier, much to the delight, no doubt, of the Comanches. The hated Tejanos were now relegated to a secondary role in policing the territory they claimed as their own. So for a time, the lightning-like raids of the Rangers gave way to a new government policy for dealing with the Indians' defense instead of offense. This meant a return to the centuries-old Spanish practice of building presidios, or forts, at wide intervals across the frontier. Instead of launching strikes into enemy territory as the Rangers had been doing for the past decade, the U.S. military began a policy of conciliation toward the Indians, fearing that the Texas Indians would side with Mexico in the war raging at that time between that country and the United States. The federal government created a special commission whose job it was to offer the Indians of Texas and the southwestern prairies alternatives to battle. By 1860, the U.S. government had convinced a number of Indians to settle on reservations, but it would be another 7 years before some of the Comanche bands would make a treaty with the United States. Meanwhile, the Comanches, under the leadership of Pita Nocona, continued their depredations along the western fringes of Anglo-Celtic settlement in Texas. According to James T. DeShields, the condition of the frontier in 1859 to 60 was truly deplorable. The settlers were obliged to stand in a continued posture of defense, and were in continual alarm and hazard of their lives, never daring to stir abroad unarmed. For small bodies of savages, quick-sighted and accustomed to perpetual watchfulness, hovered on the outskirts, and spring in from behind bush or rock, surprising their enemy before he was aware of danger. They sent tidings of their presence in the fatal blow, and after execution of the bloody work by superior knowledge of the country and rapid move, ments safely retired to their inaccessible deserts. In the autumn of 1860, the indomitable and fearless Pita Nocona led a raiding party of Comanches through Parker County, so named in honor of the family of his wife Cynthia Ann, committing great depredations as they passed through. The venerable Isaac Parker was at the time a resident of the town of Weatherford, the county seat, and little did he imagine that the chief of the ruthless savages who spread desolation and death on every side as far as their arms could reach was the husband of his long-lost niece, and that the commingled blood of the murdered Parkers and the atrocious Comanche now courses in the veins of a second generation, bound equally by ties of consanguinity to murderer and murdered, that the son of Pita Nocona and Cynthia Ann Parker would become the chief of the proud Comanches, whose boast it is that their constitutional settlement of government is the purest democracy ever originated and administered among man. It certainly conserved the object of its institution for a longer period and much more satisfactorily than has that of any other Indian tribe. The Comanche is the most qualified by nature for receiving education and for adapting himself to the requirements of civilization of all the southern tribes, not excepting even the Cherokees, with their churches, schoolhouses, and farms. It is a shame to the civilization of the age that a people so susceptible of a high degree of development should be allowed to grovel in the depths of heathenism and savagery. But we are digressing. DeShields' digression led him away from his discussion of Pita Nocona's fierce leadership in his efforts to block further settlement of the Buffalo Plains. Every year since the intrusion of aliens into Comancheria, the Buffalo Range had constricted in size. As a result of encroachment from all sides, the raiders' cruelty in frequently subjecting their victims to lingering deaths had root, at least in part, in their hatred of men who had invaded the buffalo lands and in the process had butchered Comanche women and children. And it probably explains the motivation for a Comanche revenge raid in 1860 that put an end to conciliation and resulted in all-out war between Indians and whites that led, among other events, to the recapture of Cynthia Ann and her return to her relatives. Revenge raids were common among the Indians, and they were characterized by the specification that a certain number of whites would die. An example is a raid by the Kiowas, as described by Colonel Nye. After the last rays of the sun had painted scarlet and gold stripes across the sky, and purple shadows were blackening in the canyon, the people climbed the slope to the lodge of the medicine man. They seated themselves respectfully before it. Soon the rustle of wings was heard, followed by the eerie cry of the hoot owl. Mamal T, the medicine man, emerged from the darkened teepee. "The revenge raid will be a success," he announced solemnly. "At least one enemy will be killed. None of us will die." 7. After leaving Indian Territory, the war party of 50 men cached some supplies just north of the present town of Quanah, Texas, and continued toward the settlements. They camped on a hill east of Seymour, where Mamonti again consulted his medicine. He told the warriors that the next morning 1 or 2 whites would be killed by men mounted on gray horses and that hunting horse. The youngest member of the party would receive a fine bay. It was a hot July sun that greeted the Kiowas the next day. Mamonti led his men to one of the favorite raiding areas of the Southern Plains Indians, the Butterfield Stage Road between Jacksboro and Fort Griffin. There they chased 4 cowboys who managed to escape. From a hilltop, the Kiowas later saw a party of rangers following a trail that, unknown to the Kiowas at that time, had been left by a raiding party of Comanches on their way back to Indian Territory. Mamonti and Loud Talker rode down the slope in sight of the rangers, who pursued the wily Kiowas into a trap where 2 lines of warriors attacked the whites from both sides. At the conclusion of the battle, 2 rangers lay dead, killed by Kiowas riding gray horses, and Chief Taboni Ma gave Hunting Horse a fine bay, ridden by one of the dead. In the aftermath of the battle, according to Nye, presently Lone Wolf stood back to make a speech. He said, "Thank you, oh thank you, for what has been done today. My poor son has been paid back. His spirit is satisfied." 8. Whites also sought revenge, not only a life for a life, but on at least one occasion, a scalp for a scalp. Shortly before the Kiowa revenge raid, a band of Comanches killed Josephus Browning and severely wounded his son in an attack on the Browning Ranch on the Clear Fork of the Brazos near Weatherford. A party was quickly formed by John R. Baylor and Walter Reynolds, and the men rode in pursuit of the Indians. On June 28, the Texans overtook the Comanches on Paint Creek and killed 13 warriors. After scalping the dead Indians, the ranchers returned to Weatherford with the Indian scalps and the scalp of a white woman whom the Comanches had killed on their raid. The townspeople of Weatherford proceeded to stage a macabre celebration. The occasion was celebrated by a public barbecue on the square in Weatherford, at which stirring speeches were listened to by a vast assemblage from every portion of the surrounding county. In the evening, a dance was given at the courthouse, and on a rope stretched diagonally across the large room were hung the arms and equipments captured by the party, and also the scalp of the white woman, as well as those of the slain warriors. Gruesome decorations for a scene of festivity. General Baker exhibited these trophies of the Paint Creek fight in many other places, and everywhere among the settlers arose the cry, "Exterminate the Indians." 9. John Baylor was one of the more outspoken foes of the Red Man, although he had once served as on-site agent for the Penateca Comanches at the reserve on the Brazos River. Baylor had left the Texas Indian Bureau after being accused of incompetence in the keeping of records of receipts and expenditures. By the time of his dismissal, he had already lost the small measure of rapport he had once had with the Indians, and after his removal as agent, he went on the offensive against Major Robert S. Neighbors, his former boss. Baylor asserted that Neighbors habitually protected agency Indians from accusations by area whites that they had stolen stock. In the fall of 1860, the White Man, a local Weatherford newspaper, editorialized in support of Baylor's posse. Tian. The most desperate effort has been made by Governor Houston of Texas and his friends to create the impression that there is a large, well-organized band of thieves and murderers, rather than Indians, on the frontier who are committing most of the depredations on our citizens. According to other sources, unscrupulous whites did indeed profit from horse stealing, robbery, and murder, while taking great care to cast blame on the reservation Indians. Even those settlers of some conscience were not above planting evidence to incriminate the agency Indians and force their removal. 11. Baylor's agitation to have the Indians removed from Texas resulted in the Reservation War, in which law-abiding citizens witnessed to the fact that vigilantes were killing helpless and aged Indians. Without the protection of United States troops, the mob of armed men surrounding the Texas Indian Reserve would have massacred all of them. John Baylor's partner on the white man, a journalist named Hamner, was himself adept at stirring up public opinion. In the September 13th, 1860 issue, he wrote, "The present condition of the frontier is truly alarming. Not a week passes that we do not hear of fresh depredations by Indians. In Palo Pinto County, we learned that near 100 head of horses have been stolen within the last 2 weeks. But a short time since a Negro man, the property of a Mr. Craven, was killed by Indians in sight of the town of Palo Pinto. In fact, not a light moon has passed since last fall. But some portion of the frontier has been annoyed by Indians. The road is lined with movers from the different frontier counties who have at last determined to quit the country and seek protection in the older states, where they can at least know that they are free from the annoyances they have been subjected to. For 3 years past, the frontier people have begged, prayed, and supplicated both state and federal governments for protection, and the federal government has displayed a cold-blooded indifference to our condition. That would do credit to the Tsar of Russia." 12. It was in the midst of this tinderbox of racist hatred that the Comanches carried out a raid that shocked even the already outraged frontier. It may or may not have been a revenge raid, but a Mrs. Sherman was brutally murdered, while her husband and children were spared. In this case, the behavior of the Comanches was very strange. It is possible that the Comanche who killed Mrs. Sherman on the western fringes of Parker County did so in revenge for the loss of a wife, sweetheart, mother, or sister in a Ranger attack, or most probably in one by U.S. soldiers and Tonkawa scouts. If this was a revenge raid in which a certain number of people were to die, it might explain the Indians not capturing Mr. Sherman for purposes of torture or bondage. Leaving the children behind was also unusual. Each child represented many horses and trade goods as ransom, even though the Indians often became attached to the little ones, as in the case of Cynthia Ann Parker, in which case mountains of goods and a herd of ponies could not ransom them. The Shermans, neighbors of frontier scout and cattleman Charles Goodnight, had moved to the rolling grassland of Parker County, totally ignorant of the dangers awaiting them on the Great Plains. Goodnight, who had come to Texas from Illinois at the age of 9, had lived since childhood on the edge of the plains. By 1860, he and others like him were customarily armed with 1 or 2 Colt 6-shooters, a rifle, and a Bowie knife. They knew the land and all the plants and animals it supported. They knew where to find water. They could communicate in English, Spanish, and, in some cases, Comanche and French. And, amazingly, like their Spanish predecessors, they managed to acquire minutely detailed knowledge of the region, even though they were surrounded by myriad hostile enemies. Young Mr. Sherman, on the contrary, did not even own a gun. He had brought his pregnant wife and 2 children to the edge of what was then known in all geographies as the Great American Desert, and he was ill prepared for what was to befall them. Goodnight gives this account of the Comanche raid on the Shermans. Sherman, with his wife and 2 children, had settled in the east end of Stag Prairie, in the western edge of Parker County, at which place the Indians stopped about noon as they went back westward. The Indians were carrying a large herd of horses out with them. As they came into Stag Prairie, the rain was descending in torrents. They dismounted, came into the Sherman's cabin where the family was eating dinner, and drove them out. The family started to cross to the east side of a narrow prairie where a neighbor by the name of Stevens lived. A quarter or half a mile, the Indians followed the Shermans and overtook them about 100 yards from their cabin. They drove Sherman and the 2 children away and badly mistreated Mrs. Sherman. After shooting 2 or 3 arrows through her body and scalping her, they left her near the house still alive. She lived until the next day, giving birth to a dead child. 13.
This is the end of chapter 3, part 1. Thank you.